You're not falling apart because someone attacked you. You're not collapsing because life is loud or cruel. You're being quietly dismantled by yourself, by the choices you make in silence, the nod you gave when everything in you wanted to shake your head, the smile you forced when anger was boiling in your chest, the yes you whispered while your soul was screaming, "Get me out of here." And you call it maturity. You call it diplomacy. You call it keeping the peace. But let's name it for what it is. Surrender. Not to a sword, not to a tyrant, but to 1,000 moments where you chose to shrink. You're leaking dignity, not because someone stole it, but because you stopped guarding it, and the world noticed. They stopped asking what you think, stopped checking in, stopped measuring their tone around you, not out of disrespect, but because you taught them not to. You taught them that you don't need to be consulted. You'll show up anyway. You'll nod. You'll agree. You'll stay. You'll explain. And they love it. Because it's easy. Because you're easy. But Machiavelli said it clearly. Everyone sees what you appear to be. But few truly understand what you are. And when people think they fully understand you, they stop fearing the cost of crossing you. Because what's predictable is exploitable, and the man who is always explaining, always softening, always available, becomes background noise in a world that only hears thunder. You don't need more kindness. You don't need more patience. You need a strategy, a reason to stop asking for respect and start commanding it through presence, not arrogance, but clarity. Because Machiavelli never wrote for the well-behaved. He wrote for those who wanted to survive without self-erasure, for those who knew that kindness without boundaries is just a death by 1,000 accommodations. So, ask yourself, are you still begging to be loved, to be included, to be safe? Or are you ready to return to the version of yourself that knew how to leave a room and let the silence echo like thunder? Because this world doesn't remember men who are nice. It remembers those who made absence feel like tension, who could vanish and still be heard. If this is stirring something inside you, not hope, but that quiet rage you buried long ago, then don't run from it. Let it rise. Let it burn. And if you're ready to stop playing a game you never agreed to, drop this in the comments. I no longer ask permission to be respected. And subscribe not to follow me, but to mark this moment. The moment you stop being the diluted version of yourself and start walking the path Machiavelli laid out for survivors like you, because from here on out, you're not playing to be liked. You're playing to be remembered. Now, let's begin. They're not shouting. They're not arguing. They're not launching an attack. But make no mistake, you are being erased. Not with violence, not with betrayal, but with something colder. Indifference. At first, it's subtle. You're still in the room, still invited, still heard technically. But something's shifted. They talk over you. They move on without your input. Your voice lands, but no longer leaves a mark. Your words are met with polite nods, then promptly forgotten. You're still included, but never really felt. So what do? You smile. You nod. You understand. You tell yourself this is maturity. But is it? Or is it the beginning of your quiet cancellation where you're not exiled? You're just no longer necessary. Machiavelli would have smirked, because he knew what most men today have forgotten. Respect isn't granted to those who accommodate. It's given to those who disturb. You think your tolerance is noble, but tolerance, unchecked, is not a virtue. It's a strategy, just not one that works. Let's pause for a second. When was the last time someone paused before speaking to you? When was the last time someone thought, if I say this, he might walk away? If the answer is never, you already know why this part of the video exists. You've become too available, too predictable, too safe. And the predictable man, he doesn't command a room, he blends into the background, while sharper men bend the energy around them. Let's be honest, people don't ignore you because you're unimportant. They ignore you because you've trained them to. You'll bend, you'll adjust, you'll smile through discomfort. You'll stay, no matter what they say. And when a man becomes that easy to read, he becomes easy to disregard. Machiavelli said, "It is much safer to be feared than loved, if one must choose, but don't mistake fear for intimidation." He meant presence. Presence that creates pause. And pause creates power. Right now, you're not creating pause. You're creating comfort. No one watches their tone around you. No one hesitates before crossing your space, because they know you won't push back. You won't leave. You won't surprise them. And what can't surprise can't lead. So if you feel hollow, if your opinions are skipped over, if your presence lands soft like a feather instead of sharp like steel, this is why. Not because they're cruel, but because you've taught them that your attention comes without cost. And if there's no cost, there's no value. This is the moment that matters. The fact that you're still here, still listening, still watching, it means something inside you isn't dead yet. It's just been buried beneath years of being nice. And that ache you're feeling right now, that sting in your gut, that's not weakness. That's strategic pain. The kind that doesn't just hurt, it reveals. So let it reveal something. Let it burn away the parts of you that settled for being tolerated instead of being respected. Because the man who's willing to feel the sting of truth is the man who's finally ready to change his fate. So I'll ask you directly, are you ready to become the man people pause before speaking to, the one they can no longer predict or ignore? If this part struck something in you, write in the comments, "I will no longer be easy to ignore," and subscribe. Not because I told you to, but because you're choosing to step into the version of yourself that no longer shows up to be seen, but to be felt. Next, we go deeper into the emotional exposure that turned your honesty into vulnerability and your openness into leverage for those who never earned it. Let's keep going. They didn't need to break you. They never had to raise their voice. They didn't demand anything from you, because they didn't need to. You gave it to them. Not your money, not your time, but something far more valuable, your emotional access. You answered too fast. You shared too early. You revealed too much before they even earned your trust. And each time you did, you taught the world a silent rule. Your soul is public property. You called it vulnerability. You told yourself it was being real. But was it? Or was it you confusing honesty with exposure? Machiavelli would have warned you long before the damage was done. Because to him, power doesn't come from what you reveal. It comes from what you withhold. He wrote, "A prince should be slow to believe and slow to reveal." Not because he feared connection, but because he understood human nature. The more access people have to your truth without earning it, the less they value it. They skim your stories like headlines. They flip through your pain like pages in a gossip magazine. They take your deepest wounds and reduce them to content. Let me ask you something. When was the last time you shared something real and it was actually protected? Or did it become ammunition, used when it was most convenient for them and most destructive for you? You thought sharing would make you closer, but all it did was make you easier to categorize. easier to label, easier to discard. And here's the brutal paradox. The more you tried to connect, the faster they pulled away, not because you weren't deep, but because you handed over that depth without demand. In a world addicted to emotional convenience, what's free is forgotten. What's unguarded is unvalued. And you're left wondering, why don't they ask how I feel anymore? Why don't they protect what I give? Why do they listen, but never hear? It's simple. You never made them earn it. And what isn't earned is never held with care. Machiavelli wouldn't tell you to be cold, but he'd tell you this: never reveal more than you control. Never explain more than they deserve. Because power doesn't beg to be understood. It selects. It filters. It chooses when to speak, what to show, and to whom it is granted. So what now? Now, you rebuild, not by shutting down, not by becoming a ghost, but by becoming strategic. You don't speak less to be mysterious. You speak less to be precise. You don't explain less to seem powerful. You explain less to remain in control. Your mystery is no longer a flaw. It's your currency. From now on, you let people wonder. You let them question. You let them earn their way in. Because the moment you stop handing out your soul like a free sample, you become expensive. And in a world full of emotional beggars, being expensive is the highest form of power. So the next time someone asks for your truth, pause it and ask yourself, have they earned it? Or are they just curious? Do they intend to protect it or dissect it? Because not everyone deserves your sadness. Not everyone can handle your truth. Not everyone is qualified to hold the man you've become. And if this hits something raw in you, drop this in the comments. My emotions are no longer on sale. And if you're done being emotionally cheap in a world that only values mystery, subscribe now. Not to get validation, but to reclaim control. Because the moment you stop bleeding for people who never brought bandages, you stop being food and start being fire. Now, we enter the next battlefield where kindness becomes bait and silence becomes survival. Let's go deeper. You've been told your whole life, be kind, be understanding, be easy to be around. And so every time someone crossed the line, you gave them another chance. Every time they pushed, you moved the boundary back just a little. Not because you're weak, but because you were afraid. Afraid of seeming rude, afraid of looking too cold, afraid of being labeled difficult. So you smiled when you wanted to leave. You said, it's okay, when everything in you screamed, this is not okay. You swallowed your truth just to avoid making others uncomfortable. But here's the truth no one tells you. Every time you say yes to what breaks you, you say no to what could rebuild you. Machiavelli warned us, a prince who cannot establish order will be devoured by his own people. So ask yourself, who are your people? Your partner, your co-workers, your friends, your family. Not all of them are malicious, but all of them respond to what you allow. And what you've allowed has taught them something dangerous, that your space is flexible, that your limits are negotiable, that your presence has no price. They didn't cross the line by accident. They crossed it because you never made it real. You drew it in sand and watched them kick it with a smile. Because when boundaries aren't enforced, they're invisible. Here's the deeper wound. Somewhere along the way, you started equating being liked with being safe. But you weren't safe. You were just convenient. You kept the peace, but went to war with yourself. You played the good man, but behind the smile was a quiet scream. And still you apologized for having needs. You negotiated your worth like it was a favor. But Machiavelli would have said it straight: if people do not fear losing access to you, they will never value being near you. So let me ask you this. When was the last time someone had to earn your presence? When was the last time you let silence be the consequence? Not an argument, not a guilt trip, just distance. Because a man who sets no limits is not being generous. He's being exposed. You think your softness is your virtue, but without a sword, softness is bait. This world does not need more men trying not to offend. It needs men who protect themselves from being consumed. Men who walk like fortresses, not to push people away, but to protect the parts of themselves that took years to build. Because your time matters, your peace matters, and your presence should never be assumed. So, if this truth landed like a punch to the chest, write in the comments, "My boundaries are not up for negotiation." And remember, this is not about becoming cold. It's about becoming clear, because the moment you stop making space for those who constantly disrespect it, you don't become less loving. You become untouchable. Next, we confront the disease you've been taught to wear like a badge, the apology reflex. The instinct to say sorry for simply existing. Let's get to the root. You don't say it out loud, but your life whispers it. In how you lower your voice when you speak. In how you add, "just my opinion," as if your thoughts need a warning label. In how you shrink your presence before anyone even asked you to. "I'm sorry I took up space. I'm sorry I have needs. I'm sorry I'm here." And you call it humility. You call it politeness. You call it not making things about you. But let's tell the truth. It's not humility. It's learned invisibility. Because somewhere along the way, you were taught that to be accepted, you had to be small. That to keep the peace, you had to stay out of the way. So now, you don't just apologize for your mistakes. You apologize for your boundaries. You apologize for your standards. You apologize for the very core of who you are. You apologize for existing too boldly. But Machiavelli would have warned you, you cannot govern the hearts of men. But you can control how they approach you. And the way they approach you starts with how confidently you hold your space. Every time you over-explain, every time you soften your voice, just to seem less intense, every time you smile through tension just to avoid a ripple in the mood, you train the world to treat your presence like a problem to manage instead of a standard to respect. You think transparency builds connection, but transparency without control is emotional nudity. And no one protects what they were allowed to consume too quickly. You thought if people understood you, they'd love you. But people don't love what's easy to get. They love what challenges them to rise. Let's be brutally honest. Every apology you didn't owe was a small betrayal against the man you were becoming. You asked for permission to exist instead of declaring your place. You made your identity a group project. You waited for consensus. You softened your truth so it wouldn't bruise weak egos. But Machiavelli didn't write for the agreeable. He wrote for the ones who ruled themselves first. Because power doesn't ask. It doesn't beg. It doesn't negotiate. It simply is. So what does that look like? It looks like walking into a room without flinching, without softening, without shrinking. It looks like being so anchored in your self-worth that others adjust around you not because you asked, but because your presence requires it. And that is where true respect begins. Let me ask you directly. When was the last time your silence made people speak more carefully? When was the last time you walked away without apology and it left them rethinking everything? Because you're not here to be palatable. You're here to be powerful. If this cut deep, and you recognize the soft apologies stitched into your daily life, drop this in the comments. I'm done apologizing for being me. Now, we step into the trap that feels smart, but secretly weakens you. It's not fear. It's not emotion. It's the logic trap. The belief that if you can just explain yourself enough, they'll finally respect you. Let's break that illusion. You've been taught since you were a boy, if people just understood you, they'd respect you. That if you could explain your pain clearly enough, they'd stop causing it. So you try, you explain, you clarify, you soften your tone, you write long texts, you speak gently, not because you're unsure, but because you're hoping they'll finally get it. But Machiavelli would have looked you in the eye and told you something brutal. Not everyone misunderstands you by accident. Some people understand you perfectly and still choose to cross the line. Because for them, your explanations are opportunities, not revelations. Every time you justify your silence, you turn it into hesitation. Every time you explain your no, you give them a chance to reframe it as maybe. And every time you defend your limits, you suggest they are negotiable. Let me ask you, how many times have you explained yourself to someone who already showed you they didn't respect you the first time? And what changed? Nothing. Because logic doesn't fix betrayal. It only makes it easier to swallow. You don't win by convincing people to stop hurting you. You win by removing access so they no longer can. Machiavelli didn't believe in justifying a position. He believed in demonstrating it. He wrote, "Men are so simple, and so much creatures of circumstance, that he who deceives will always find someone who will let himself be deceived." In other words, people don't believe what's true. They believe what serves them. So, you can pour your soul into words. You can over-explain your intentions. You can cry, plead, write long messages. It won't change anything for someone who already decided that your clarity is inconvenient. This is the logic trap, and here's the cost. The more you explain, the more you train them to expect it. And when everything needs an explanation, your authority dissolves. Your no sounds like uncertainty. Your silence sounds like weakness. So what's the alternative? It's simple. Let your actions do the speaking. Let your withdrawal say what words never could. When someone disrespects you, you don't owe them closure. You owe yourself distance, because if they can predict you, they can manipulate you. But if your response is cold, scared, and final, they will pause. And in that pause, you take back control. You don't need to explain your absence. You don't need to defend your standard. You don't need to soften your decision. You just need to stop narrating your worth to people who never earned the right to hear your voice. So I'll ask you, who are you still explaining yourself to that has already shown you they'll never listen? And if this hit like a slap to the mind, drop this in the comments. No more explanations, only action. Because sometimes, the most powerful sentence you'll ever speak is silence. And now, we step into the most seductive illusion of all empathy. Not as virtue, but as the weapon used to drain you slowly, until kindness becomes your cage. Let's go. You were taught to be good, to be forgiving, to be empathetic, to see the best in people. So you gave. You gave again, and then again, second chances to people who never deserved the first. Silence to those who needed consequences. Time, peace, energy to people who never intended to give anything back. And you didn't call it weakness. You called it love. You called it compassion. You said, "This is what good men do." But Machiavelli would have called it something else. Naivety, self-destruction, voluntary victimhood. Because empathy without boundaries is not virtue. It's an open wound, begging to be exploited. You believed that if you loved harder, they'd finally treat you right. But some people don't want love. They want access. Access to your softness. Access to your silence. Access to your ability to keep giving, even when you're breaking. Let me ask you, how many times have you stayed silent? Not because they deserved mercy, but because you were afraid of being called cold. You thought understanding made you noble. But understanding someone who is actively disrespecting you doesn't make you enlightened. It makes you complicit. You're not solving the problem. You're feeding it. And worse, you're teaching them how to drain you again. Machiavelli said, "Men are ungrateful, fickle, false, cowardly, and covetous." He wasn't telling you to hate people. He was telling you to stop walking into battle unarmed. In a world of predators, your unchecked empathy isn't kindness. It's blood in the water. Every time you stay silent to keep the peace, you're not creating peace. You're creating permission. Permission for them to cross the line again, to disrespect you again, to pretend they didn't know better. And they'll call it a misunderstanding. They'll call it your sensitivity. They'll call it just being human. But they knew, and you knew, and yet you stayed. Why? Because somewhere deep inside, you were still waiting for your kindness to be rewarded. But here's the brutal truth. They didn't love you. They loved your compliance. They loved that you didn't say no. They loved that you always understood. They loved that even when it hurt, you stayed soft. That's not love. That's control. So what now? You stop. You stop giving where there is no return. You stop bleeding for people who never once offered a bandage. You stop mistaking your empathy for a superpower when it's actually become your leash. You don't have to become heartless, but you do have to become selective, because not everyone deserves the privilege of your care. So I'll ask you one final question. Who in your life do you keep trying to heal when all they've ever done is reopen the wound? If this truth woke something in you, drop this in the comments. My empathy now has a gate. Because the moment your kindness learns to guard the door, you stop being consumed and start becoming untouchable. Next, we confront the addiction you didn't know you had. The need to explain, to narrate, to justify, not because it helps, but because you're afraid not to. Let's break the pattern. It starts innocently. A message to clarify. A quick follow-up to make sure no one misunderstood you. A soft, just to be clear at the end of every sentence. But slowly, it becomes a reflex, then a habit, then an addiction. You can't say no without padding it. You can't set a boundary without a backstory. You can't walk away without leaving behind a 3-paragraph emotional essay. And you call it maturity. You call it communication. You call it being respectful. But Machiavelli would call it what it truly is: fear. Not fear of being wrong, but fear of being misunderstood. Fear of being called selfish. Fear of being labeled cold, unreasonable, or arrogant. So you soften, you revise, you explain again, and again, and again. Because deep down, you still believe that if people just understood you, they'd respect you. If they saw your heart clearly enough, they'd stop hurting it. But they don't, because some people don't want understanding. They want leverage. And your need to be understood becomes the tool they use to keep you small. Let me ask you, who benefits from your explanations? Who gets to keep access to your time, your energy, your loyalty, just because you keep making sure they're not offended? Every time you explain your no, it sounds like hesitation. Every time you narrate your silence, it sounds like doubt. And that's how you lose power. Not in one big betrayal, but in 1,000 small justifications you whisper daily to keep everyone comfortable. But here's the brutal truth. If you always need to be understood, you will always be controlled. Because what is predictable can be disarmed, and what is always explained becomes cheap. Machiavelli didn't waste words. He let actions speak. He let decisions stand. He knew that power isn't loud. It's undeniable. So what happens when you stop explaining? You become unreadable. And unreadable is uncontrollable. Your silence becomes a sentence. Your distance becomes a boundary. Your no becomes a complete answer. You don't need to announce your worth. You walk in it. You don't need to explain your choices. You enforce them. You don't need to translate your pain for people who weaponized your clarity the last time. Because when you finally stop justifying yourself, people start adjusting to you. They measure their words. They pause before pushing. They feel your absence as weight, not as weakness. And that's the shift. That's the moment where the man who always tried to be liked becomes the man who is respected in silence. So I'll ask you clearly, what would your life look like if you said nothing? And let the silence carry your message. If you felt no urge to explain your worth, if your peace no longer needed a footnote, if your limits were enforced, not discussed, if this cut deep, drop this in the comments. My silence is now my answer. Because the next time someone crosses the line, don't explain, don't argue, don't narrate, just leave. And let your absence echo louder than any speech ever could. Now, we arrive at your new territory where silence becomes strategy, where absence becomes power, where leadership begins without apology, without explanation, without permission. Let's close the loop. Something changes when you stop explaining. Not in them, in you. You walk differently, not faster, not louder, just heavier, more still. Like a man who no longer asks for room, he is the room. You no longer speak to be understood. You speak only when it counts. And when you don't speak, your silence is understood louder than any plea arm sees. You don't enter a space hoping to be accepted. You enter it, knowing, if your presence isn't welcome, your absence will be felt. And strangely, they begin to adjust. Not because you demanded it, but because your energy now carries weight. Your boundaries now echo. Your silence now costs something. You're no longer the man who begs to be included. You're the man whose presence sets the perimeter, whose withdrawal leaves a vacuum. And that vacuum, that's where power lives. Because people don't respect what's always available. They respect what they had to earn. They respect what can disappear. And now you've become earnable. Not by playing games. Not by pretending, but by becoming clear. Clear about your voice. Clear about your value. Clear about who gets to access you and who no longer can. You don't need to lead with noise. You lead with gravity. Because you've remembered something most men never learn. Power is not the ability to control others. It's the refusal to be controlled. So now the question is simple. Are you still waiting to be chosen? Or have you finally chosen yourself? Because this world doesn't need another man apologizing for his existence. It needs a man who rules not with cruelty, but with clarity. Not with dominance, but with discipline. Not through fear, but through the fear of losing him. So if something in your soul shifted on this journey, if something dark and silent and powerful woke up again, drop this in the comments I lead. Without needing to be liked. And never forget, the most dangerous man in any room is not the loudest, but the one you can no longer read. Because that man has nothing left to prove and everything to protect.